Okay, welcome everybody. We will have 4 distance students, but Stephanie's actually with us today. So, but we will typically have 4 students in this class coming in by distance. So, distance students, welcome. So, who do we have? We have Iris, and if I choose the wrong name off my list, just tell me. So we have Iris. Iris, where are you coming in from? Can you unmute your mic for just a second?
Hi everyone. I'm in Markham.
Markham, okay, great. And we have Erin. Erin was here as on-site student last year, so where are you coming in from, Erin?
I'm coming in from my mom's kitchen in Dallas, Texas.
Okay. That sounds like a thoroughly decent way to do a class, I just must say, your mom's kitchen. Okay, and we have Sam. So Sam, welcome. And where are you coming in from?
I'm in my church basement in Washington State.
Okay, well, welcome. Okay, so good to see you guys. From time to time, I actually do forget that you exist up there. So you just have to say something like, excuse me, or Judy, or woohoo. In other words, give me an auditory cue because I'm often looking down at my notes or around at the class. So just give me a bit of a verbal cue and we'll get you involved. Okay, so welcome. Let's begin with a word of prayer to begin our day. The Lord be with you. Gracious God, we thank you for the gift of this time together. Pray, Lord, that the learning that we do here will bring glory to you and will help us to share this gospel message with those that have not yet heard it. Bless our work together. Be with us in our deliberations and our discussion. Give all of it to you, Lord, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So first off, I want to introduce to you Charles Meeks. Charles, over here, is going to be marking your book reports, your TA for this course. And Charles and I have worked together before. He's going to give you lots of good feedback on your writing. And I don't know if you've all seen that funny skit where the professor is kind of the good guy who welcomes you with open arms, and the TA is the one that really gives you crap. But we hope to work well together. So Charles will be marking 2 of these assignments. So he won't be with us every day, but he's certainly welcome to be here whenever he likes. This term, I don't have to miss any day. And I'll explain why. I'm sometimes outside of the college. So Charles, you don't actually have to teach a class this term, but possibly the next course that you're going to be TAing with me. Okay.
Can Charles wave to the camera?
Where's Charles? Wave to the camera. Oh. Perfect. You probably can't see him. So Charles, come on up here, just so that our distance students can actually see the face of the person that is going to be marking. Can you see him there?
Hi.
Thank you.
Awesome, great. Thanks for that, Sam. Okay, so if you came in and didn't pick up a card, you need to get one of those 2 cards. If you do not have easy access to a syllabus, there may or may not be one syllabus left there. If you don't have one, if you can at least be seeing one. So look over with somebody else. Okay, so the study of evangelism, it actually really sits at the nexus of several disciplines. Theology matters in evangelism, who God is. Really critical to what you're going to say to God, how to people about God. Biblical study, where do the scriptures fit in evangelism? And, you know, I don't know if you've had the experience of people kind of using the scriptures in a not so pleasant way. We want to be careful about the way in which, and thoughtful about the way in which we use scriptures, but the scriptures bear the message of the gospel. So this is also key to us. Missiology. What you think about the mission of God matters to evangelism. How does mission work? What is the kingdom of God and the mission of God in this world? And finally, ecclesial practices. Practices of the church. For many people, they think of evangelism as strictly an individualistic effort. Where does the church come in? We're going to be talking about ecclesial practices that impact evangelism. So by studying evangelism through the lens of biblical conversion narratives, that's the way this course is structured. My hope is that Scripture itself will inform our discussion and learning. Because what I've found over the years is everybody arrives at this class with some preconceived ideas about evangelism. When someone first saw this little thing saying, please choose a card, their response this morning was scary. That tells us a lot of things about what those two words mean, how people perceive them. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later. First of all, I want to be absolutely clear about the structure of the course so you have a good sense of where we're at. I want to check in with our distant students. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the first half of the course is laying some foundations for talking about evangelism. What are the gospel, mission, church, discipleship, and conversion? Those are packed words. What do they actually mean, and how are we going to use them in this course? What is evangelism, and why do it? And what are the connections between evangelism, theology, and ecclesial practices? So we're going to lay the groundwork for evangelism in the first half of the course. And you're probably wondering, why on earth are we reading? If you've looked at the dates of some of the readings in this book, you're thinking to yourself, wow, that was written a long time ago. Why are we reading that? This book is full of sort of the big name people in evangelism. And why do I have you read from this book? Because I want you to know what these people have said about evangelism. Some of you may be surprised that these people have said anything about evangelism. What have they said? By reading what they've written, you're also going to get a sense of some of the discussion points about evangelism, some of the approaches, some of the points of conflict. So when you read this book, we will be referring to it tangentially in class, which is why I have you submit reading notes for these chapters. When I say a reading note, what I mean is basically half a page, point form, and I lay those out very, very clearly in the instructions. So basically what I'm going to have you do when you come into class, and the distant students, you can send me these reading notes electronically. Literally, I'm just looking to see, did you do what the reading note assignment said, and you're going to get a check mark. So I don't mark them. I'm not reading through them. They are for your purposes to remember what these people have said about evangelism. And I just want to say that reading notes, you may think they're just busy work, but especially if you go on to do further academic study and you do either a doctorate of ministry or a PhD, let me tell you, when you're trying to remember where a certain quote was when you're doing writing, reading notes are your best friend. As far as this course goes at the professional graduate level, it's helpful for you to remember just what you've read, and it kind of means it's going to be worth a little bit more to you later in the term. Okay. Second half of the course is looking at practices around evangelism. So we're going to be looking at things like, how do you as church leaders cultivate parishes, churches that know how to share the faith? How do you share the gospel with children? We're going to talk about one of the assignments. We devote actually a whole class to talking about what happened when you did the Bible study project. So this is, it's important for you to read the syllabus carefully around this particular assignment because you should be planning now. As in, as soon as you leave this class, be planning, who might you ask to do this project with you? Someone who is not part of the church, someone who may have never had any kind of religious or philosophical conversation with, but it's somebody that you actually have some sort of relationship with. I've had students that have done it with a best friend in Chicago, and they did the whole thing over the phone. I've had students do it with a barista in their local Starbucks who they just happen to see every single day. I don't care who it is, but I want you to take seriously the reading of this assignment. So you're to choose 3 passages from the Gospels, and you are to invite someone to discuss these passages with you. And you're going to reflect on those conversations, what you learned, what the conversation was like, what surprised you. We're going to talk about translating and contextualizing the gospel. We'll talk a little bit more about what that is later. We're going to talk about evangelistic teaching and apologetics and what those have to do with evangelism. We're going to talk about what it's like to preach evangelistically. And we're going to talk about this thing called the mixed economy or missional church. A church in which we can no longer just set up shop, open our doors, and people will flock to us, as they might have in the 60s. We're in a different situation now. We have many, many people in our Canadian and American societies who have nothing to do with the church or any faith or are part of some other faith group. Okay, so any questions about any of that? Stephanie?
Yeah, sorry, to fill down. Are your PowerPoint going to be posted on Fortis after each class?
Yes, they will be.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't generally read from my PowerPoint slides. I mean, we're doing a little bit more of that today. They are more of sort of a kickstart. So they are highlighted points, but you're not getting the fullness of what we're going to be talking about in these slides, but it will definitely assist you. Think of it as an outline for the class. Okay, so again, in this course, I am just as much interested in helping you be able to share the faith as I am in helping you equip others to share the faith. Because one of my main sort of points that I hope you get across in this course is that the sharing of the faith, the bearing witness to Jesus Christ, is for all Christians. All Christians. And yet, we've ended up in a different place. Okay, so just very briefly a little bit about evaluation. There are really 4 key points of evaluation. One is engagement. So engagement, you know, there are students that like to talk in class, and there are students that don't like to talk in class. We don't want to make you into somebody else, but I do expect you to come to class prepared and to be willing to participate. And participating means sometimes not talking if you've had a lot to say already. So we want to encourage an environment in here in which there's a little bit of risk-taking and there's a little bit of joviality too. Okay. The book reviews, which Charles will be marking. In the syllabus, you're going to find sort of a spelled out way. Sometimes in courses, especially first year classes, if somebody in our first year, you may have never actually written a book report or review. Especially if you're coming from some other area of study in your undergrad. So do pay attention to what we're looking for there. The Bible study project I've already talked about, and then the integrative project. An integrative project is a project which integrates the full teaching of the course. So in there, you're going to see you need to write a sermon. That sermon should not be one that you gave a few weeks ago and pulled up, even if it seems like appropriate to the context. So the integrative project should be integrating all the stuff we've talked about. And I ought to be able to see evidence of that in your project, okay? Okay. Any questions about any of that?
Would you give a 5-page sermon at a funeral?
Absolutely. Yeah. Double spaced. 16 font. Okay. How are we doing in evangelism?
Bad.
Bad? Why do you say bad?
The 3 words most commonly associated with evangelical Christians in North America are homophobic, judgmental, and hypocritical. Not Jesus, not love, not compassion, not acceptance. So that's a problem.
Right, so what you're saying when you say we're doing badly is there's a lot of resistance to Christianity in general. So you're talking about bad being the context in which we're doing, sharing the faith?
We have done a bad job of showing who Jesus is, and that is why there is this attitude.
Okay, okay.
I think that Christians are generally afraid of sharing the gospel because either they don't know how to enter into a spiritual conversation or they fear offending someone. So I think the content of the gospel is offensive inherently, but Christians are simply not equipped, or they're not used to engaging in this manner of dialogue. So I think it's culturally difficult to have that manner of speech.
Okay, interesting.
I mean, I think in the Canadian context, I think there's certain language, semantics, idioms that we are allowed and not allowed to use. And I think it becomes very difficult for us to know, as language changes, how to speak about faith or really about anything. Sometimes getting into conversations just about anything that might potentially be, especially in our, the last 2 years, becoming more and more politically polarized. And it's very hard to have conversations across the aisle in a civil manner. People that you're not sure if you're even on the same page. And that's even beyond things. Like that's politics, that's like everything, right? And we're having a harder time even just having civil discourse about differing ideas.
Right, okay. Matthew? And then Sean.
Just kind of a reflection from my own tradition. So, I mean, Pope Benedict, maybe he was Pope Paulsen, I really don't know, but one of the Popes before Francis, where he kind of launched the new evangelization, and that was supposed to be for the Catholic Church this new thing to like get out and evangelize, because we kind of just realized, like you said, like setting up shop and not really doing much in the way of, actually physically evangelizing to other people, and just kind of hoping people would be like, wow, the Mass, church practices, let's just flock there. It wasn't really working. And to be honest, like coming from Newman and talking about it, like the new evangelization program isn't working either. So like we're kind of doing a bad job on our end too, and like I don't really know what the answer is, but hopefully I will by the end of this course.
I think a lot of Christians, myself included, are a bit gun shy in the context of a culture where Christianity is seen as a joke, and the name of Jesus is seen as a swear word that's used all the time. It's really hard to bring up your faith in that context.
Right, okay.
In our rural church, so people just don't agree on what the gospel is about. As we started MSC Church event last year or three, and there it really came out that in the end we do not really know what to pass on. But also what people do agree on is that it should be lived out. And this is what they're very keen to do. So it's more, in people's minds, it seems to be more a practical thing than ever talking about it.
Yeah, so there's two things in what you said. We don't really know what the gospel is. And if we did know what the gospel was, we would prefer people to just read our minds about it, right? Somebody else with their hand up.
Similar to what you just summarized, is that I think a lot of people don't feel equipped to be able to do it. I think generally in Christendom, the population, I think there are many people who can't adequately describe what the core of Christianity is. And even if they can, perhaps not how it's affected them. And so I think that so there are external pressures that many people have talked about so far, external, I guess, factors that inhibit people from speaking, but also I think internally, I think many people don't feel equipped.
Right.
I think Sam has a comment.
Yeah, Aaron?
Oh yeah, I think Sam has a comment. And then I'll go after him.
Sam, okay.
Thank you, Aaron. You can go first.
I love that the distant students are helping each other.
Well, I'll just say for my context, which is university campus ministry, that I see both evangelism happening and not happening, both in problematic ways. I see evangelism happening that's super awkward and abrasive and sort of like, oh my gosh, like try to get by those people. And I also see Christian students who are ill-equipped and scared to share their faith for any sense that talking about something that they consider to be exclusive or significant to them might be offensive to their classmates. So, and I'm sure my work with InterVarsity has probably fallen into both camps at some point. But I see that struggle, wanting to share their faith, doing it, but doing it poorly.
Why do you think they want to share their faith?
I think I see a lot of students who feel like that is what they're supposed to do as Christians, but they don't know. I mean, I'm sorry, Judy, I didn't hear you.
So guilt?
Guilt, yeah. And maybe obligation might be like a slightly more positive way of saying that.
Okay,
I also, yeah.
We'll talk more about that. And Sam?
Yeah, I agree with Aaron, but also it depends on how you define these terms: evangelism, witnessing. Somebody said we are constantly witnessing and doing evangelism every day in everything we do. The question is, are we good or bad witnesses?
Right. Okay, so I hear in all of these, we're going to explore a lot of the stuff in this course that has just come out. But I actually didn't hear anything positive about evangelism. So how are we doing? Bad. Yeah, for all kinds of reasons. I hope to give you a very different view of evangelism. I hope to give you a very different view of evangelism. Okay, so how are we doing? So there was a Disciples of Christ survey done in the United States, a Lilly-funded research project in which they asked 25,000 members in 262 churches. So these were lay people that were asked to consider 53 statements, and they were to rank them in terms of their agreement level. The two statements that were ranked last were these two. So dead last is this one. This church is effectively reaching unchurched persons. Dead last. Second last, this congregation provides training in sharing Christ with others. So that's pretty interesting. Both of these things have to do with evangelism. I think all of the things that you mentioned are also things that a lot of Christians are grappling with.
I'm just curious, is this survey cross-denomination, or was it one specific one?
This was particularly with the Disciples of Christ churches, which are kind of deemed a mainline church in the United States, one of the larger denominations. I suspect that would be very similar across many denominations. Judy?
I'm also just wondering if in the context of 9/11, was this because of the whole, like, what could we have done differently? No, because, you know, I would say probably in the last 20 years, like, the church has been more bunkered and more, you know, scared because of that new reality.
I think you're right. I think we've seen increased polarization. We've seen people even more reticent to talk about religion in general. Okay, so those two last statements, though, I think we would probably agree are a problem. We'll go into what the church's response could be. Okay, further research into the North American church's relationship with evangelism. The mainline evangelism project, the results of which are covered in this book called Unbinding the Gospel, Real Life Evangelism. So this was a study that looked at 7 denominations. So the Anglicans didn't make the cut, we're not big enough in the States. American Baptist, Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ, Evangelical Lutheran, Presbyterian Church USA, Reformed Church in America, United Church of Christ, and United Methodist Church. So these are large denominations, and this project drew stats from 30,000 churches across these denominations. What they found was that there were pockets of churches that were reaching unchurched and de-churched people, but they were primarily ethnic churches or churches in a particular belt called the Bible Belt. Outside of those congregations and outside of ethnic churches, fewer than 0.5% were baptizing significant numbers of adults. So adult baptism in an age in which there are many people that are unchurched or de-churched, many people have had no connection to the church whatsoever, adult baptism is still kind of your golden standard, right? If you are not baptizing adults, or in Anglican land, we might say confirming or reaffirming if they were baptized as children, you're not reaching unchurched or de-churched people, basically. So it's the gold standard. So here we have less than 0.05% who are actually reaching unchurched people. What about here in Canada? So last spring, Angus Reid conducted a poll on Canadians, and what they found was that 51% of Canadians believe in God in some form. So they have all kinds of ideas about God. They're all over the place. A full 31% would be described as privately faithful, and another 20% are actively engaged in a faith community and the practice of faith. But a full 30% are privately faithful, according to this poll. So fewer than 20% of Canadians now have any meaningful church connection. Fewer than 20%. The 2011 Canadian census revealed increased percentage of Canadians describing themselves as having no religion. So 24% of Canadians on the 2011 census describe themselves as having no religion. So clearly, the market, if you like, for sharing our faith is there. There are 10 million Canadians who describe themselves as privately faithful. Their theology's all over the place. What they have rejected is involvement in any institution. Okay, that's kind of where our scene is right now. What do you conclude from this data? I mean, does it depress you? Does it excite you? Is it well known to you? Matthew?
I would say that it's both upsetting, just for the what. I would say it's upsetting and it's exciting. It's upsetting in the sense of, okay, you directly look at the numbers and they're not that high, and you're thinking, well, that sucks. But it's exciting in the sense of, I don't want to make a blanket statement, and I don't mean this, obviously, take it with a grain of salt, right? But I remember one time, one of the priests at my old college had said, someone said, oh, if we can only go back to the day when everyone was at mass, blah, blah. And he said, no, watch your language. He said, we don't always want to do that, because he said for a lot of people, they still didn't have a serious mature faith life. It was just done out of an obligation, because that's what they thought of it. So what I think of when I look at this data is, okay, well, number one, we can figure out what have we been doing that has led to this drop, and two, what can we do differently to bring people back in a meaningful way, because clearly what we were doing before wasn't working. So what sort of fresh kind of idea do we have to do, and what sort of fresh way of engagement do we have to try to reach people, because it just seems full of potential to me.
Right, so two things there. So the glory days, in which a lot of parishes will tell you about their glory days, when there was 100 kids in the Sunday school. I think you need to be ready to say that's tragic, because clearly the glory days were not really the glory days. The same people that were in Sunday school in the 60s and 70s, they're the ones that aren't having anything to do with the church today, most of them. So yeah, the excitement part. I hope that you leave this course thinking, I can't wait to teach people about evangelism, because I'm more convinced than ever that this is the age in which it's exciting to be a church leader. And we'll talk more about that. Josh?
I always have a kind of visceral reaction when I hear these statistics, because on the one hand, it is exciting, and I affirm the sentiments previously expressed. On the other hand, it seems to me like it's a serious indictment on the churches that are not evangelizing, or that are not seeing the fruit of the Spirit, because I do see all of this in an organic relation, because the body of Christ is an organism, a spiritual temple. And so there's always a second layer. I then look to the leadership of these churches. So for me, it's evangelism, but it's also ecclesiology, and it's also a matter of doctrine. Because what are these people preaching that is either not producing spiritual fruit, or B, driving people away? And yes, the gospel is offensive, right? You're either going to be saved, or you're going to reject the gospel and harden your heart and go in the other direction. But there are pockets of successful evangelism, and there are churches that are growing exponentially. So what can we learn for those? And I don't want to be polemic. I'm here with the rest of you all, but it's upsetting, really.
What's really interesting to me is I think we're in a time in which our theology is being refined. Our view of Scripture is being refined.
Just what you said before, the Sunday schools that also, what I find interesting in it, I live in a town of 4,000, quite isolated town, and so a lot of people I know have sat in Sunday schools when they were children, And what they did was that they are very social justice and, as a kind, really kind people helping each other out, which makes them for an extremely high quality of life in this town. But they have little concept that God might be real and that you could relate to Him. And so they have stopped going to churches. And the next generation that I see has no clue that there is God, so somehow we have proven that there is none, kind of thing. And they don't have the mindset of it would be important to love each other, And so I think in the next generation, at least in this town, we see an enormous drop in quality of life, and it will become much more apparent again that people from churches stick out more in their lifestyle than they do right now.
I think you've really well described the dilemma. What happens to the church when Jesus becomes a means to the end of social justice? So it's not that social justice issues aren't super important and have a high profile in Scripture, but if the end is just us working harder to make sure this thing called social justice happens, what we end up doing is just another form, I would argue, of Phariseeism. We're placing a burden on people's shoulders that doesn't have much life-givingness to it. So what we want to do is actually help them encounter the living God who will turn their lives upside down and often co-opt their lives for the cause of justice and peace and many other good things. But if we get that order wrong, we can end up simply putting a burden on people's shoulders. And I think what you mentioned, Josh, about what is being preached, there are churches in which a friend of mine who's in Greece was visiting another church, and on a Sunday morning on their holidays, and this church does not anymore use the creed, but they've written their own creed, and one of the lines from that creed is, "We will not idolize Jesus." Now he said, I don't even know what that means, but there's something weird about it, So this is why evangelism engages with all these things. It engages with Scripture, it engages with theology, it engages with ecclesial practices, like our outreach projects, like our prayer groups, all of those things. Can you tell me your names? I can't see your actual name.
Paul.
Paul. Okay, Paul.
Just related to what you were just saying and what Joshua, Gabby, and what Joshua was saying about doctrine. So there's an interesting, I can't remember the person's name, but there's someone out of Waterloo who's done research into churches and why some of them are declining and some are not. And his conclusion is that the churches that are not declining are ones that maintain the centrality of Christ, his death, bodily death and resurrection, and him as the Son of God and our Savior. So, those are the ones that are actually growing. Interestingly, just you were talking about social justice, he also said churches that put social justice as the key goal of their church are actually doing less social justice than the churches that have Christ as the central part of their doctrine, and because people's lives are actually impacted by God, they're changed, and then that actually flows out of.
So there's two things about that research. This is the Haskell research out of Waterloo, and it was exploring mainline churches and looking at what were the defining factors in which mainline churches were either growing or not growing. And one of the determinations of that research was that a more conservative theology lended itself to growth. So one of the things which is important to know, but what I want to know as somebody interested in evangelism is, where is that growth coming from? And that is a question that final research project avoided answering. However, I happened to be sitting in at St. Paul's Bloor Street when they came to present their initial findings. And guess what they found? That the growth in those churches was largely from disaffected evangelicals. They were looking for a more conservative, but more open practice of the faith. So, well, you could say sheep stealing. I mean, I think people vote with their feet. Many people that are in sort of very highly legalistic contexts, sometimes where there's severe literalism being applied from the pulpit, they vote with their feet. They're looking for something else, and those people are very unlikely to go to a very liberal church. They're looking for something that has a broader orthodoxy. So while that is a very important finding, don't think it grabs the evangelism issue. I want to say it's not good enough for us to say, look at us, we're growing. I once talked to a lead pastor from one of the most quickly growing mega churches in the GTA, and he told me that on one Sunday, they had 250 people come over from another mega church where there'd been a blow up about, I don't know, they changed the name of it or something, and people didn't like it. So you know, we have to be a little careful when we talk about growth. I think that the data out of the US study, which was looking at a whole lot of churches, 30,000 churches, and they found 150 that were baptizing significant numbers of adults. So then they began to look at what those 150 were doing, which is the really interesting thing. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. Okay.
I think that so many people are obsessed with numbers and growth, and it seems to be it's a false goal in a lot of ways. It's the quality of each arrival or each conversion or each faithful person.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that in the early church, they didn't seem to actually care much about numbers, but they had explosive growth in the church. In the early church, you know, because there was persecution in many places, the worship of Christians was actually pretty tightly controlled. And nobody was invited to Eucharist until they were baptized. They had tighter controls on things than many churches do today. They existed in a place of persecution, and yet they had explosive growth. They weren't pushing for growth, but they got growth. So what were they doing? And we're gonna talk about that. What was the early, in fact, what do we see in these stories that resulted in people coming to God?
I was going to say that I wonder if the churches that are growing, and even maybe culturally, there's that element of just hospitality and sharing life. So I know maybe that's later, but just that being together more relationally. And I wonder if that's even sustains the evangelism, the actual word of mouth is getting person to person.
So we're going to talk about what are the ecclesial practices that actually mirror what we see in Scripture and mirror those periods in the church's history in which there was really significant sharing of faith. Can anybody think of another period of history in the Christian church in which we saw growth by unchurched people and not coerced growth related to armies and things.
Thinking about the Chinese church under communism. So that's a very recent thing where.
Yeah, so it's so interesting that during the Cultural Revolution, the church in China lost its pastors, lost its books, lost its ability to gather freely, and yet there was explosive growth there. And I think it's estimated that by 2030, there will be more Christians living in China than in any other country in the world. So that's pretty interesting. Cool.
I believe a professor from another seminary wrote a book called The Church in Exile, where he talks about how it's not the church of the mainstream that is growing and fruitful, but it's the church that's in exile. It's the church that is being pushed to the outside and having to actually work for their status in society and their communion with people. It's not the one that is at the forefront speaking not from the pulpit or from the stages of the society.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff. That's a Judy book, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of good stuff in that book. One of the pushbacks against that book is that by comparing the church to the Israelites sent into exile, is that we are then trying to get back to Israel, get back to the temple. I don't actually think he's saying that in that book. But we need to be careful that what we're not trying to do is get back to Christendom. And, Christendom is when we built a lot of buildings. And our buildings became, in the main line, our buildings became a primary focus. Some of that was really good. Sometimes those buildings were places of community gathering. They served a really important function. But people began to talk about the church as if it was the building. And that's created all kinds of problems for us. Okay.
Judy.
Yeah, Sam?
Oh, did I interrupt someone?
First. Okay. Yeah?
You said we're going to look at 150 churches. Is this in America, mainline churches?
Yeah, so this was 150 churches out of the mainline evangelism project. These were the churches that they ended up doing more in-depth research on to see what they were doing that enabled them to be reaching unchurched people and de-churched people.
I have a question about one specific church, which I'm not sure if it's one of them, the Church of the Resurrection with Adam Hamilton. Are you familiar with Adam Hamilton?
Say more. Tell me more.
I think they're in Kansas City, and they're United Methodist, and he is, I would say, center left. He's written a lot of books, but they're really growing, and I know they just built a huge building, and it's kind of looking more like a mega church, which is a little odd for United Methodists, but I'm not sure if that's, I'm a little confused by what's happening with that particular situation. Why is it growing? Is it evangelicals that are kind of moving more to the left, or if they're actually reaching unchurched people?
Yeah. I don't know enough about that particular church to offer any comment on that. I would just say that when we're talking about growth, I'm looking not just for average Sunday attendance. I want to see adult baptisms. Okay. Because attendance, people are as human beings in the across North America today, they are often attracted to the latest and flashiest in terms of church, and that's part of a cultural effect on us. So that doesn't mean mega churches are not doing good work. But when you can show up at a church of 3,000, you can be completely anonymous If you do not join a small group, and most mega churches work super hard to get people into their small group ministry, but very few are more successful than getting 25% into their small group ministry. So, you know, the question is that a good model for forming people in the faith when you can't actually know what is going on in their life? I won't say it can't happen. I think there are churches really working hard at this and doing really good work at this. But I would say we need to be careful and pay attention to the way in which the culture is affecting our behavior in sort of subconscious ways. And the attraction to cathedrals across the UK, for instance, offers the same thing. So it's not just evangelical churches.
Yeah, like cathedral worship's way up.
Yeah,
it's churches are dying.
It's way up because they can offer the biggest and best and flashiest, right? They can also offer anonymity, which is something we increasingly want in our society. So anyway, Julia.
I wonder about that old standard for adult baptism, but then I wonder kind of beyond that, because, you know, in the evangelical, like some of the, you know, there's that whole thing of like just getting the number count, right? And if we are talking about chair shuffling, basically just shuffling the chairs on the deck and not actually conversions, then is also part of that around catechesis or discipleship as well, in terms of what does growth mean, right? Because I mean, you can go through your baptism class and get done, but that still is not necessarily how we actually disciple, right?
Yes. Yeah. So discipleship and evangelism are not the same thing. Yeah. Wow. Great discussion. I distant students, I haven't heard from you guys lately. Iris or Aaron, anything to say, or are you good? You're good. Okay. Who hasn't said anything yet? Nina.
I was just gonna say, I feel a little bit hesitant. Like, I don't know. I'm sitting here struggling because I know that eventually you need to use numbers to talk about growth, to talk about, like, I guess, success. But even the idea of like the kingdom being something that's either successful or not feels like very strange to me, and I feel uncomfortable about that because I just like know that Jesus promised that he would be with us to the end of the age. And I belong to a small kind of missional prayer community in Hamilton, and we do a lot of I guess it would be evangelism, although I think that we're a little scared of that word. I don't know why, because I guess there's just people on our street corners that yell at other people, and apparently they're from Jesus. But anyway, I think that what I've most often seen is that when folks come into our fold and accept Jesus and decide to follow him, like, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're attending church. It just means that they're part of our little community, whatever that means, because maybe they're just off social assistance and they need to work on Sundays, or maybe church is still really uncomfortable to them because they have baggage, and maybe they'll get baptized. But I've had one guy who showed up drunk to our baptism because he's just got so much going on in his life and he was afraid. I don't know. And does he follow Jesus? I have no idea. And I feel kind of scared to assess that even, because it's like, that sort of feels like it's not my business. And I want people to follow Jesus, but I feel a little bit afraid about, like, I totally hear what you're saying, and I think that I belong to a church that maybe sometimes uses Jesus to get to social justice, but I also see other churches that use Jesus to get to a big number.
Yeah. Or a new building.
Yeah.
Or big programming.
And that can be almost scarier because there's kind of maybe a money incentive, but I don't know if that's too cynical, but it might also not.
I mean, I think in all of this, we need to keep in mind the parable of the sheep and the goats, in which it's perfectly clear that we're not the best ones to judge who are sheep and who are goats, because apparently there's going to be some surprises there. So I would say, yes to everything you said. I think numbers and big building and big programming, that sounds like a cultural influence itself, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That definition of success sounds very much like the broader world that's all into globalization and, making money, which of course is also the critique that many people have of the church. So yes to all you're saying, and also a little pushback in the sense that when a person finds life in Christ, that matters. And their baptism, I mean, I remember baptizing a young woman who had a horrific past. I mean, she'd had more pain in her life in her first 20 years than practically anybody else I've met in my entire life. No church background. She had no idea what went on in church buildings. And she was from Britain. I'm thinking, how does that even happen? Where, the state church is such a state church. And when she was baptized, she stood over the font, and as I poured the water over her, she began to weep because it was such a momentous decision for her, and she knew that her life was going to take a very different path now, and she had found something that she had been longing for her whole life. And so I also want to say that baptism counts, and I want more churches to be paying attention to those moments, and I want those things to be what drive diocese instead of average Sunday attendance, which is going down for all kinds of reasons, and some of them you've mentioned. The fact that people are increasingly working on Sundays. The fact that the person that has a high commitment to church is now in church 1 out of 3 weeks. High commitment. So our average Sunday attendance is going down for all kinds of reasons. Some of them cultural, many of them cultural. And I think we need to be thinking about new numbers and new ways to track what we're doing. And as leaders, you're going to be making decisions about those things. You're going to make decisions about the kind of way in which you engage with people outside the church and help them into a relationship with the living God and nurture them in that faith. Okay, one more, and we're going to take a quick break.
I want to affirm what Nina was saying and what you suggested. Numbers aren't everything. And I know there's a tradition around Prophet Jeremiah. I don't think he had many converts himself, but he was successful in the Lord's eyes. So we're also commanded to do evangelism. Results aren't always they're not always our responsibility, but we have to be faithful, so we must. But what I wanted to add is, we don't always speak about the Christian campus ministries that exist. And, I've been a student for 6-7 years between undergrad and graduate. I've never participated in campus crusades for Christ or Power to Change, and these are well and good. And sometimes when I hear about intervarsity and stuff, perhaps I'm just jealous, but I think that some of these missional groups are more successful than the churches. And in the past, I've spoken to churches that I belong to about being more active on campus. And there was a hesitancy because it was kind of an unspoken assumption that the campus groups, which are not specifically churches, but there may be parachurch organizations, are like untouchable. And I'm kind of emotional right now, but this is not like I'm speaking on the fly, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But maybe these groups should also consider coming under the umbrella of actual churches in the local community, so that there's not a competition between your evangelical church here and the group that is being funded by students who's are not accountable to the local church because they are whatever. These are just things that I'm wondering, how does that impact the local environment?
Yeah, I think you touched on a really important point that we're going to discuss more. organized church? Does it matter? If it's not doing evangelism, can you be doing evangelism without the church? What is that tension that's there? One of the most interesting campus ministries that I've seen is a church called Lift Church out of Hamilton. And, they started just doing sort of campus ministry, but then they said, no, what we actually need to do is plant churches on university campuses. So they have planted one at McMaster, now they've planted one at Brock, and next year they plan to plant a church at Guelph. Pentecostal sort of background. I think they have a loose association with PAOC. Their focus is to reach people on campus, and those that are still going to be there 10 years from now, great. And those that won't be because they're going to be heading off, great too. Their intent is to reach everybody on that campus for Christ, but as a church. I like that idea. Anyway, okay, let's take a short break, 5-minute break. We're going to come back and I will want to hear why you chose the card you chose. So distant students, as everybody came into this room, they were asked to choose a card from 2 cards. One card says evangelist and one card says evangelie. So everybody just picked one, and as we work through some introductions now, we're going to ask, I want you to do it sort of digitally. Just think, which card would you pick if you had walked in? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back. All right, so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to just really briefly go around the room quickly. I want you to say your name, a question that you have that you hope this course answers, and the card you chose and why you chose it. So, James, why don't you kick us off?
Hello, my name is James Scholl. I'm a 3rd-year MDiv at Wycliffe here. I am taking this really early. So I think this will answer. I guess I am intrigued in this one. Ultimately, I think the church has got evangelism wrong in a lot of ways, and so I'd quite like to explore some ways of getting it right.
Is there a positive way?
Well, there must be, right?
I like that. That is hopeful. That's awesome.
I mean, I'd argue it's probably putting Jesus front and center, but apparently that's quite controversial. So, I picked evangelist, but only really, I sat here deliberately so I could pick whichever one felt easiest at the time. I was worried it was going to be an exercise, so I just grabbed whichever one was easiest. Although, whenever I do that 5-fold ministry of gifts thing, I always come up as evangelist, which saddens me deeply. Really, really affected.
You have such a negative view of evangelism that when you yourself are identified as an evangelist, you worry.
I did the testing. I did it on 2 different websites.
Okay, that's really negative view. That's awesome. Okay, but you're hopeful.
Yes.
Are you gonna hang on to that?
Always.
Yeah.
My name is Kathleen Lucas. So I'm from the Ottawa Valley. The diocese I'm in is the diocese of Pembroke, and so most churches are not viable anymore. They have to restructure some of the ministries here. And this is what I intend to so this is what I plan where I plan to work in the future. So I have lots of questions, of course, and this is very relevant. The way I look at it is, I was trained as a doctor. I worked as a doctor for a few years, and we had in order to assess health, we always had to work like numbers, but it was never about just getting those numbers up or and down. In the end, the goal was always to get the state of health up, and this is what I hope for as well, to get behind those numbers and see, what is the state of health and how can I counterbalance in order So that these churches more healthy and closer to Christ and
Nice image.
more alive.
What card did you choose?
Sorry.
Which card did you choose?
I honestly did not know what it was about, so I
Nobody did.
imagined it would be a role play.
Good. So which card did you choose?
Evangelism.
So you chose evangelism. Right. So how many thought this was going to be role play and that they were kind of terrified? And you chose the Okay, no role play. No role play. Not today, anyway. Not around this question. Okay. Zachary.
All right, I'm Zachary Barkas. I'm a second year MDiv. I think one of the reasons I chose this course was in part because I know I have a lot of misconceptions about evangelism. And it's always one of those things people are like, let's go evangelize. And I kind of have this kind of reaction. And I want to just be more positive about it, even though it's something I think is key and important.
So what do you mean when you say that you have this reaction? What does that feel like?
I guess, so coming fresh out of being in school for the last 18 plus years, where it's told you're not allowed to talk about faith, and that when it is, you have a lot of people react negatively, like being forced on them. I guess I'm up in the Bible Belt too. So another thing is it's very preachy. When you talk about faith at school, it's something that's very upfront and give you everything you can know about the Bible in 5 seconds, and that's kind of overwhelming. So I think I just have had
everything you know about the Bible in 5 seconds.
Yes.
That's a lot of pressure.
And I was
Dog is love.
empathetic towards the people who were being thrown on them real quickly. So I actually always kind of experienced it from the other side where I'd go, oh yeah, that's a lot. Even though I absolutely believe it, it's like, oh yeah, that is a lot all at once. So just going towards how to approach it positively and how to share in a way that's welcoming to others.
Right.
Is what I mean forward.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things I hope for in this course is that you will realize how many people are out there who have spiritual longings and questions. Sometimes when I speak, particularly to clergy groups, I hear the myth of secularization, and it is our out. It's the way in which we say, well, society is so secular, people aren't interested in talking about this anymore. Actually, the research just does not hold up that point. So I hope that you will not only have a profound sense that people have spiritual longings, but that actually the Christian faith offers a completely unique response that meets that need. And that our bigger challenge is to appropriately contextualize the gospel so that they have ears to hear it. And what Josh said, you said something about the results, and I think you said the results aren't all on us, or something like that. The results aren't at all on us, not somewhat. Conversion is a work of the Holy Spirit, period. So we need to actually lift that burden off our shoulders. And we're going to talk a little bit about that more as we go along. Okay, let's keep going. Back in the back there. I can't actually see your...
I'm writing big, but it's still really small. I'm
Catherine. Hi,
Kat.
Catherine.
I had no idea what this class was going to be about. It was basically, I needed a second class, and apparently I need to put this check mark on my transcript thingy, so apologies. It was basically, all right, it's in the morning, I can catch the train, this could work. So apologies, it'll probably be fabulous, but it was very self-centered with the, I can catch the 8 o'clock train in and I'm not up at the crack of dawn.
Very pragmatic.
If I could be sitting at home in my pajamas with a cat on my knee and doing this, that would be even more better. Except he likes to play on the computer. I really don't, oh, he's awful. I don't really have a question. Part of my problem is that my husband is not baptized. He comes with me every week. He's gonna make a fabulous priest's wife. I told him he's gonna have to join the choir and learn how to cook. But he has no desire to get baptized, and it drives me spare. He believes, we have conversations, and he has no desire. He doesn't see why he needs to get baptized to be a good Christian. And my daughter, who I hauled off every week, who did Sunday school, who was baptized, confirmed, and everything else, has no desire to go to church. She goes, Mom, we're getting married, but we're not doing it in a church. You're just going to have to deal. But, all right, well, here's my heart on a platter. Thank you very much. You're awesome. So for someone who believes and has no desire to have the outward showing, and the other one who taught Sunday school and got hauled off every week, who doesn't want this huge, big day nowhere near a church. So, yeah. And that's just like my, the husband and the kid. Yeah. So, but like at work, they all know that I want to be a priest, and they all think that's highly, highly amusing. But I can have conversations about God and Christ at work with all right, thank you very much. And then we all just go back to what we were doing. So, is it the person who comes looking for for someone who might have an answer, or is it browbeating you over the head with the family Bible saying you will believe this is good for you?
Okay. So as we walk through scripture, we're going to talk a lot about conversion process. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And I think from what you're saying, that you have a sense that when I say those words, conversion process, I have some prescribed agenda. And you will be surprised that that it's just not actually a recipe. But we'll talk about that. Okay. Cool.
Well, I'm a second-year MDiv student, and I don't know. I've had experience with street evangelism and its allergic power to change, and I dreaded every moment of it. It's just not how I think things should be done, and it made me frustrated seeing that this is how they thought it should be done, and the only way that they really did it. And I chose Evangeli just because I often find myself sort of relating more with the people who are on the outside looking in. And these are the people, when talking to other evangelical Christians, they're like, oh, I don't understand how people couldn't believe, or I don't understand how people hold that view. And it's like, well, I get it. Like, it's not, they're not out there like being irrational. They're actually thinking these through, and they've just come to the conclusion that they don't believe in. The church doesn't understand that. They don't understand often how to talk to these people as if they have valued beliefs.
Yeah. So what you're saying is the answer to evangelism is not necessarily better arguments.
No, it's talking to people like the human.
Bingo. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be able to express reason for what people do and do it in a respectful way. But there isn't a straight line between perfect argument and conversion, because that leaves got a picture entirely, doesn't it? Okay.
My name is Darnell. I'm a second-year MDiv student. I chose the evangelist card because I feel like evangelism is a part of my ministry, and it's something that I've participated in at various times in my life. I think one of the questions that I have in this class is there a wrong way to evangelize, or if there are just different ways of evangelism and you just choose which one based on context? I'm also interested in conversion stories because I think about today's cultural context and the 21st century and pluralistic society, what it takes to see somebody convert in a real way. That interests me.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a lot about that. Is there a wrong way to evangelize? I guess my quick answer to that is any evangelism that leaves God out of the picture is the wrong way. Having said that, I've seen people that came to faith by picking up a tract on the subway.
That's just God's sense of humor.
It really is. So, you know, I hope that we leave this course with a very big picture of God's activities in drawing people of all kinds to himself. Having said that, I think there's some really bad evangelistic tracts out there, and I keep a little collection of them. Because they are driven by fear, some of them. Some of them are driven even by bad-mouthing parts of the church, which is like, let's face it, that's like shooting yourself in the foot. And some of them are just not very Christ-like. So we'll talk more about that. Okay, let's keep going. Okay.
I'm Nina. I'm in my first year beginning a part-time MDiv, commuting here from Toronto, to Toronto from Hamilton a couple days a week. What else can I say?
A question that you have.
Question that I have. Yeah, I feel like I have lots of questions. Lots and lots of questions. I think so I work for a parachurch organization that has a more new monastic model, and I also work really closely alongside refugees in Hamilton. My husband works for L'Arche, and we're really passionate about that community. And I think that we've really come to value the idea of mutuality and making friends without strings attached in our work with people who are vulnerable or marginalized. And so then I guess my question is, I guess, because I'm a Bible-believing Christian, I believe that sometimes people are wrong about what they believe, and I'm right about what I believe, and that's just super awkward. and I also just have met a lot of people who have been extremely hurt by people who flaunt that truth. And yeah, even some volunteers that come to our home for refugee claimants, I just, the way they talk is not okay, and it doesn't acknowledge the humanness, I guess. And so I want to listen to people who are different from me first, but I guess I also need to talk eventually. And so I just feel a little bit like I have a lot of questions.
Good. All questions I think a lot of people share.
Yeah.
You touch on the question of the method and the message being in agreement.
Right. Yeah.
And I think, you know, if we are baptizing people because we have an army on the hill over there that's going to wipe them out unless they, you know, we just do this in different formats sometimes as Christians. It may not be an actual physical army, but it's threatening, or you can't be part of us unless you are. You can't access these programs unless you are. So there's lots of ways in the past that evangelism has kind of been coerced by something else. And I would argue we don't need to do that. We have anything to do with that at all. Yeah. Paul?
My name is Paul Karsgaard. I'm just now starting full-time. I have been part-time for a little bit.
Can you speak up a little bit? Can you guys, distant students, can you hear any of this?
I couldn't hear that last person.
Okay.
Are the mics above me? Do I need to
Yeah, these mics.
Yeah, these are all mics, so they should be able to hear, but just because we've got the air on in here, I'm a little bit nervous about you guys being able to hear. So just try to project a little bit as you speak.
So my name's Paul Karsgaard, and I'm now a full-time student. So in the MDiv program, halfway through my first year, I guess. So I grew up in a Christian home, and from a young age, I made a commitment to Christ, and I grew up being very aware that I did not want to be like the person Zach described, where they, just download everything to anyone at any point and overwhelm them. And I know that I have gone far too far the other way my whole life. I've fought that, and probably not too successfully. But God is now, God's now bringing me to a point where it seems a lot more natural, which I'm very excited about. But I still want to learn. I guess in a way, it's somewhat technique driven. I want to be able to engage with people and be confident and calm in a way that where I'm simply responding to their questions and gently bringing. When I have an opening, I would have openings before, and I wouldn't take them because I'm so concerned about not offending them. And so I want to learn how to recognize those openings and gently steer the conversation towards Christ.
I would say that one of the most important questions I hope you grapple with in this course is God actually calling people to himself?
Yes.
I hope we all not only say yes to that, but say, absolutely. Now, if we actually think about that, then it frees us from a lot of this crap. Because we know that if God is actually calling people, then what we actually need to do is attend to the way he might be calling them. We need to attend the kind of questions they're asking, the needs they're expressing. We need to actually look at the way our lives intersect with theirs and see that that actually may be a way in which God is actually calling them. God's call is, because he's a timeless God, God doesn't have a prescribed, you must present the gospel and get the person to sign a dotted line in half an hour approach. And we're going to see that in the stories of Scripture as well. Okay, I can see that we are not getting through this whole class. But it's been really rich conversation. So what I'd like to do is just maybe invite 4 or 5 more people that would like to share. If you have a particular question that you think would be beneficial to the class and you'd like to share a little bit about your situation, let's have, Julia and Liam and Josh and Stephanie and Matthew. And Amber will get you. We'll also get you. Okay. Okay, so Julie.
I guess my question would be, working in a multi-faith place, or no faith or whatever, in locales like that, and in the world, and friends and such. It's easy to have civil conversations about kind of the practicalities of our different faith things. Like, oh, you went to the mosque, you went to the temple, that's really great. Oh, I went, and that's fine, and it's very respectful, very Canadian in terms of having those kinds of conversations, and kind of being, for a lot of friends, kind of like, who will be like, oh, well, the church or Christians are like, oh, but not like you, and being the exception to the. But my question is more like, how do we kind of get beyond Canadian politeness and also being that exception to the big problem that is the church, right? If all I am is okay, fine, so I'm imaging Jesus, that's really nice, but translating that to like, right?
So this question about how we function in a pluralistic context is a really interesting question for us today. It's interesting for all kinds of reasons. And there's no one answer, I think. So, you know, in the city of Toronto, there are people who associate as Muslims who have had dreams and visions of Jesus, who now are, who get their hands on a New Testament and start to realize they have to imagine Jesus in a different light and consider themselves followers of Jesus without leaving their Muslim identity. Wow. Oh, this pushes against so many of our understandings as a Christian. And I would just say this is something that cross-cultural missionaries have been observing for years, and it messes with the institutional church in a big way. We're going to talk about that. And if you take the course Gospel, Church, and Culture, you're going to really talk about that, because we have those people. Then we have, has anybody read Newbigin's either The Open Secret or The Gospel in a Pluralist Society? Leslie Newbigin deals with this question. So the Gospel in a Pluralist Society was, you know, a major book that came out in the mid-90s, and it's still one of the best books to deal with that question. So I would just say, because he takes this approach as somebody that worked and ministered in a cross-cultural setting in which Christians were in the minority in India, he speaks with authority on that issue. So the Gospel in a Pluralist Society. Yeah, so that is an excellent question. We'll be touching on that, not as much as we would in the Gospel, Church, and Culture, but we'll touch on it a little bit. Okay.
My name is Liam, and the big question I've had is the role of apologetics in evangelism. I was often very much opposed to that, and I wanted people to just know Christ through how I live, and maybe they'd come and have a conversation with me, maybe they wouldn't, but as people have come and I've approached people and had conversations, but I work in the field of engineering, it's people have a lot of, often, they don't even believe God is anything more than a myth. And so I've been faced with those questions, and it's not until I've at least presented an argument, not having an argument, but presented an argument for why you might consider something more than nature, has it been that they've been even open to continuing a conversation about the gospel. And so treading the line of, like, is apologetics something that I want to be trained in, but hopefully never have to use, or just use it as a last resort? Is it something that, is it something that I should, like, what mix of apologetics comes into approaching somebody and conversing with somebody? Certainly I don't think arguments are the way to start at slow and start with an argument, but I find there's powerful outcomes from these, like, simple apologetics, whether it's,
there's a great book by Stackhouse called Humble Apologetics, and he begins the book by talking about, he goes to an apologetic event on the university campus, and he, as a Christian, is like super powered up by the presentation and feels really great, and feels like the presenter was presented such a strong argument. But on his way out of the auditorium, he overhears these two young women speaking, and one says to the other, I don't care how good his argument was. The guy was a blank one. In other words, there was something amiss for her between the argument and the way it was being argued. So we're going to talk about that. There are reasons why Christians have been nervous about the field of apologetics, and we'll talk about those reasons. But I think we're in an age in which apologetics has never been more important. I speak from personal stuff here in that I have a son-in-law who I just absolutely adore, not raised in a Christian home. And we've kind of just watched God kind of reel him in, if I can use the fishing analogy. He's nowhere near calling himself a Christian yet. But he's asking some really interesting questions, and they're all apologetic questions. So he had no idea that people actually took the gospel accounts with any historic interest. He really, he really didn't even know that these were people writing in the first century about historic events. We often make big assumptions about what people think about what's in the Bible and what the church teaches. And it's been really interesting as, because he's in our family, people give this guy books to read, and, we have these conversations all the time. And it's been just so fascinating to hear his response to, mere Christianity, didn't like it at all. Taste for Christ, loved it.
I know!
I never predicted that at all. But the thing is, people are who they are. And as Christians, we need to pay attention to who they are first, right? Before we pull out the recipe. In fact, I would say, we'll talk about that. What is the thing we have, this treasure in clay jars that we call the gospel? What is it? We're going to talk about that a lot next week. Okay, who else is going to go?
Can I jump in, Judy?
Yeah, sure, Erin.
As the voice of God from the cloud here. So I would say 2 questions that I have that I hope this class addresses. They probably will sound like they're going in different directions. But in my ministry context, we serve a lot of students who do have some sort of Christian background and who are saying, oh, that's so great that you are sharing the gospel. But they are in some ways like kind of inoculated to any talk about Jesus. They're like, been there, done that. They're not intrigued. They're not offended. They're just kind of bored. And so just yesterday, as I was connecting with one of our staff at Baylor University, so this large kind of historically Baptist school, he has said, how do we share the gospel on campus? And really has that question for how do you share with people who have some sort of Christian background? And I think the maybe different question I also have is, I just have a lot of questions about how we share the gospel well cross-culturally. And I don't necessarily mean kind of like an interfaith context, but even just what are the different lenses and shapes the gospel takes on for instance, in my context, like in an Asian American context. So for example, how does talking about God as someone who loves you and has done so much for you and to whom you should give your life sound to a student whose parents have immigrated to the US, a lot like parental guilt coming at them to say, oh, we immigrated and we sacrificed a lot for you and now you owe us. I'm just curious about, the kind of cross-cultural implications for how we think about the gospel.
Yeah, I think culture matters a great deal in how we should be sharing the gospel. I had a student who she was from mainland China, and she said the first time she heard what she thought was the gospel was in her school in Beijing. And the way the gospel was presented was a heavy focus on sin and repenting from sin, and so receiving the grace of God to cover that sin. But she said to many people in China, we don't have this same sense of sin, and it's more about if you do something wrong, you have not learned well, you have made a poor choice, or you've made a mistake, and you need to right that. So some of the frameworks didn't speak to her at all, and she thought that's what Christianity was adopting this other framework around sin. And it wasn't until she heard the gospel through a very different lens that she really heard it. And it, completely changed her life because the lens that she needed to hear it through was the lens of a story to live by. So there was a sense in which she began to see that there were some Christian business leaders in China who actually behaved differently on ethical grounds, and that intrigued her. So she was trained as a lawyer in China. So I think the way in which we present the gospel begins with who the person is and what God is doing in their life. So it means abandoning, I think, a sense of our own control in this. So we trust that God is actually at work, active and at work, and that also doesn't mean we don't have any tools and resources. Okay, Josh.
So when I was a new Christian, and for the following 2 years, I was just doing all kinds of evangelism, like Gideon's, street evangelism, apologetics. I would even have what I would describe as supernatural encounters with people that God put in my life to deliver the message. And I think I was kind of on fire for the Lord. And as my Christian journey progressed, I kind of grew critical with evangelism and maybe even a little jaded. And so I still engage in the practice of evangelism, but I almost want to ask, how can you rehabilitate me and others like me who want to get into this again in an effective way? And how can I preach the gospel in an effective manner, not so that I can give myself some kind of self-affirmation, but so that I know I'm actually being faithful, because I do connect the practice of evangelism, or the lack thereof, with being lukewarm or hot and cold. And maybe that's unfair to me or to others, but I really do want to be a better evangelist. And I want to know, how can I be an effective witness? Because I really have an internal sense of faithfulness tied to this, because I have a sense that God has gifted me in a way to communicate the gospel. And if I'm not doing it, and in the past, it seemed like there was so much of it in my life, and now not so much. And so I have concern. Am I being unfaithful with the various callings in my life? So I speak to you as my professor, as someone who struggles with it, as someone who wants to be better at it, and has a lot of practical questions, not just theoretical questions, because I can talk to the cows come home about these sociological models and whatnot. I actually want to see change in my life. So that's what I'm putting to you.
And I love that longing, because I think that is what we want to cultivate in the church. It's not a longing to have notches on our belt, right? It's a longing to live a life of service to our Lord, right? And that we have a sense that sharing our faith is part of that. So I think, I was asked to preach at a church in Nashville about 4 years ago, and I preached on a passage that we're going to talk about in this class. And it's a passage about someone who shares their faith in a very simple way. Not at all would this person fit any of our normal descriptors as an evangelist. And yet God brings about all these dominoes falling, and this person of influence and power is won to the living God through this person speaking a very simple word into her context of influence. And all these things happen. I think that we need to be ready and equipped to share what we know about God, what we've experienced ourselves. We need to be confident that that actually makes a difference in people's lives. And we also need to be confident that God is the one that brings about the cultivation process.
Quick question, because I think one of the other challenges for people like deep into Christianity, especially in this context, seminary, working in ministry, a lot of our time and our social circles end up being Christians, Bible studies, small groups, ministry, activities, whatever. And sometimes the time or capacity we even have to spend time, non-Christians in non-ministerial roles, becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. Right? And so again, how do we, especially for a lot of people who are going into full-time ministry, who have their own parishes and own churches and own Christians, where does those margins to actually start making perhaps a larger proportion of one's life to be with people who aren't, and not in a ministerial role?
Yeah, so I would say, first off, you will spend a lot of your time with Christians as Christian leaders in the church, because you're going to be paid to do that, a lot of you. Two things. One is, that's why it's important for you to equip the whole church to share their faith. So you cannot just be, whether you're an evangelist or not, that your focus cannot just be on taking care of the people in your church. You need to equip them to share the faith. I mean, all of these 30,000 churches that were part of the Mainline Evangelism Project, they may all be very nice churches, but they're not actually sharing the faith with anybody, most of them. So that's a leadership issue. So you will, as leaders in the church, there's this internal force that's always at work, pulling your attention inward. And you will have to be really intentional about saying, here's evangelism in our budget. How much of our time is being spent engaging the neighborhood? How are we building relationships with people who aren't a part of our place yet? Having said that, what I found in parish ministry is, and I speak as somebody who, it's a joke that I ended up as professor of evangelism. I would not expect, I would never describe myself as a natural evangelist. And yet, God continually brought unchurched and de-churched people to sit in a chair before me, and some of them would just say, tell me the gospel. I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's what I have experienced. So the thing is, how will you, I mean, I'll share some of those stories with you as we go through this course, and you'll go, really? How could that happen? God will surprise you every time with how he is drawing people to himself and how he uses your most feeble efforts to help people take a step of faith. Okay. Somebody else is going to speak. Yeah.
My name is Stephanie. I will normally be up on there on that screen. I'm here in class this week. I have a two-pronged question. I don't have that question or that problem, Julia. My entire context outside of churches is non-Christian. My husband is not a Christian. My children are still in formation. My in-laws are not Christian. My father's not a Christian. I come from a family of non-Christians. And I'm going into a career of military chaplaincy where I cannot be openly evangelistic. If it gets the rules, I will lose my job. So how do I function in an evangelistic manner that, first of all, won't cause me to lose my job? But then with my family, it's the other side of the question is, it's not fair. I'm always on. Like, I always have to be this super Christian in front of their eyes, because as soon as I mess up, it's like, aha, see, Christians aren't good. It's like, no, I'm human. I suck. Like, I make mistakes. And it's the same sort of thing in military chaplaincy. I found through this summer that I was always on. I had to be the most hospitable, the most gracious, the most empathetic person at all times whenever I was in front of my people I was working with or ministering to, and it's exhausting. And I chose evangelism because I am afraid of evangelizing because I'm always making mistakes, and people are always telling me, see, that's an example why Christians suck.
So many interesting things in what you said. One of the things that I hope we will understand is that God doesn't ask us to be anything but authentic. And you cannot be authentic as a human being without admitting that you have weaknesses, that you screw up, that you're not perfect. So the perfect evangelistic message is not you being perfect. Let go of that right away. Because what that assumes is basically an impotent God. God isn't able to use us unless we're something other than what we are. And that just isn't true. So some of our assumptions about evangelism have really come out in this discussion. A lot of them have. Okay, we're literally going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to get into John 9. So 5-minute little stretch break, literally no more than 5. Get some water, take a stretch, and then we're going to discuss John 9 in our last hour. What's your name? Sarah.
My husband's military. We're going to Chihuahua right now. He's here at QMS and although his CT is on the cusp of coming through. So we could be posted anywhere.
Because it becomes easier.
So did you just say you're military?
Absolutely.
So
Literally be set up for it.
you were in Chaplin. Oh my God. So are you not quite yet? I
You don't know my life. You don't know me yet.
Okay, so what's your I can do the make you know what, I haven't even read it, so I can really root for me to have a 39 second. But I just my brother a couple years ago for agnostics and we probably had about
let me hit you with some truth, buddy.
And like, I don't know, I'm scheduled to work. I feel like this and finish my thing. So are you working with Project Paulsen?
I love when there is that result to the people that way, but to assume that like we that's exactly yeah. So what if you said like, well, I'm like, yeah, look at me, look at me. There are people that's my point.
That's the constant challenge that I have a really it's very clear experience. I'm excited for it.
So,
Oh, yeah.
So that's why.
So, anyway, and so I went through another national organization we never started. So I've been offered a conversation and started at this place that's a little bit of and I had such a hard time and I know their stories.
Okay, so here we go. The conversion of a man born blind. I'm going to read from the Gospel according to John chapter 9. I'd like you to attend to these things as I read. So the reason for the interaction, points of progression in conversion. So actually make little jot notes. What are the points of progression and where do you see them? How are we aware of them? The pain involved. So there's some conflict here and a promise involved. So what is it that happens to this man? Okay. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. Then how were your eyes opened, they demanded. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes, and he told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees who asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep sight. But others said, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? So they were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he is a prophet. The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he now can see? We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age, he can speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been born blind. "Give glory to God," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, and now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now this is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. All right. Interesting passage, no? The reason for the interaction, according to the text. Which interaction? The initial interaction with this man. Well, Jesus actually says this has happened
God's glory.
for the glory of God. So, it sounds a little harsh at first, doesn't it? The disciples are asking a question because it was very prevalently thought in that age that if somebody was born with some kind of handicap, it was retribution in a sense from God for sin. And Jesus is saying his blindness did not happen because he or his parents sinned. This happened for the glory of God, which is a little hard to see when you're looking at somebody blind. The whole thing, though, points to the missional moment in this man's life, because this man goes on, this gets spread all over the city. He's now engaged lots and lots of people. People are seeing that something has happened here, right? So there's something going on here that the works of God might be displayed. So I would say conversion itself is missional. When people come to encounter and understand God, whatever step of the way that happens, that is actually something that impacts people around them. And it's why when unchurched or de-churched people begin to experience and walk the path of faith, those people have the most powerful witness, I think, in many ways, right? Okay, what about points of progression? So what were the points of progression that you saw in this story? Where does this man start? He's a beggar, right? So he is there, it's the Sabbath day, he's looking for people to give him money, and in a sense, his blindness is the reason for him being there. it's in one sense an asset to him in this particular starting point. So he is begging. Is he expecting God to do anything?
No.
There's no indication of that, is there?
No.
So that alone is interesting. And you're going to find in your ministries that there's just weird stuff that happens to people out of the blue, and it will confirm in you your idea that God is up to stuff in the world, all over the place. Okay, so he's begging, looking for money, and he has this encounter where we're not told that much about it. I mean, how is it that Jesus just spits, makes mud, and then goes up to this guy? Like, how's that happen? But it does happen, and then he tells the guy to go to a pool of Siloam and wash. So the guy, it's evident from the rest of the story that it isn't until after he washes that he can see. So if you think about that, that's very interesting in and of itself. There's a period of time in which this guy has this encounter, but he doesn't yet know that it's going to lead to anything more than, you know, some weird guy put mud on my face. Something else is coming, right? Okay, what other points of progression do you see in this story?
As he's being questioned by the Pharisees. So he gets questioned by the Pharisees, and as he gets questioned over and over, you hear a bit of annoyance. Like, he doesn't know the full answer. He's like, why are you asking me? So there's a sense of like something's going on here. Why me? And so there's a bit of like, why are you asking me about what happened? I'm not the guy who put mud. And
Yeah,
I'm just like this.
yeah.
Yeah, he's like this innocent bystander almost.
And he's actually, at first he identifies Jesus as the man. That's it. And he doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know who he is. He most certainly doesn't know what he looks like. All he knows is he's had an encounter with somebody. And then he knows that the Pharisees are super interested in what's happening. And you see this progression where he's just telling them what happened. He doesn't know. The Pharisees are immediately identifying Jesus as a sinner. And this guy is now saying, how can a sinner do a miraculous signs like this? So he kind of goes from man to, well, maybe he's a sinner, I guess he's a man, to his next statement. What's the next point that this guy says about him?
He's a prophet.
He is a prophet, right? So someone that speaks for God, calls people back into relationship with God. And then, you know, there's the whole thing with his parents. The parents are nervous to get involved. And then they bring him back again. And now the Pharisees accuse this guy of being what? A disciple. And this guy kind of turns it back on themselves. Right? Like he's sort of, do you want to become his disciples too? It's an interesting question. Do you want to become his disciple too? Has the guy actually moved to where he's actually pretty interested in this guy, Jesus? We don't know, but the question itself is an interesting one. Maybe he's already thinking about, who is this guy, and maybe I should find out more about him. Okay, what happens next? He starts instructing the Pharisees about theology. He says, now that is remarkable that you don't know where this guy comes from, because I can see that he comes from God. So if this man were not from God, he could not do this thing that's just happened. So he's now moved from, you know, just some guy that put mud on my face to, well, maybe he's a sinner, but you know, he's done this miraculous thing, to he's a prophet. Now he's saying he is definitely from God because this has happened to me. And then he has this final encounter with Jesus. Now, I would argue that this is where the apologetic thing comes in, actually. Because Jesus says to him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the guy, I just love the authenticity of his answer. He says, who is he? Because just tell me so I can believe in him. Anybody that you say I should believe in, I'm going to believe in because you did this to me. And then he says, you have now seen. And it's kind of a beautiful little phrase, isn't it? Because he didn't see Jesus before, either physically or metaphorically, but now he sees him and he says, you have seen the Son of Man. He is the one speaking with you. And the guy, I mean, he just says it so clearly. He says, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Now, that's a pretty big leap. There is something going on here that is a little bit mysterious. But we see this actually happen in other places in the gospel where Jesus completely blows people's minds, and then the response is worship. Can you think of another situation in the New Testament where this time a group of people are shocked by something Jesus does and their response is worship?
Jesus goes to Samaria. There are 10 lepers who ask him for help, and he heals all of them. And one of them comes back and gives glory to God and prostrates and worships Jesus. And he's a Samaritan.
There's also, so there are situations like that where I'd have to check back and see, is the word worship actually used in that text? The passage, but I'd like to look at that a little bit more carefully. It certainly seems that in that text, the guy is offering adoration. A text though in which the word worship is used is where the disciples are surprised that Jesus is calms the storm. And it says, and then they worshipped. Now, for a bunch of Jews, this is weird, right? There's something going on here about their understanding of who this person Jesus is. So I would just say in this text, we see a progression. Conversion happens over time. Now, what's the pain involved? Any of our distance students want to comment on this one? Sam, where do you see the conflict in this story?
The conflict between the man and the Pharisees, or with his parents?
It's all over the place, isn't it? But it's
or within himself because of his blindness, and how God's role in that.
Yeah, there's all kinds of change happening here, right? There's change for the man. He's now not going to be able to beg as he did, for one. He's got a new relationship with his parents in the sense that he's seeing them. He's certainly got a different relationship with the religious authorities because they don't know what to do with him. It has caused a stir among all the people that have witnessed this, trying to figure out how it happened. So I would say that conversion will bring about conflict, change, strangeness, and we ought to be ready for that, because when people actually adopt a new worldview, that's what's happened with this guy. there's going to be the normal conflict brought about by change. So whether change is big or small, there's going to be some conflict there in terms of operating in new ways. What were you going to say, Sam?
Oh, I have a weird sense of humor. I was going to say his conflict came from idolizing Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what that church meant by that statement, but I guess I'd be saying there's a lot of stuff in the New Testament where it looks a little bit like that's what's going on. Yeah. What about the promise involved? In this story, we have somebody that has, suffered not only physically with blindness, but the question that the disciples ask itself at the beginning of this interaction tells us something about the worldview that's operating around illness in Jesus' time. Now think about what that's like to live with that. Think about what that's like for his parents to have lived with that. And you may think, I don't know, if you've dealt with people who are suffering in your lives, you will know that this is not just a view that we can relegate to the first century. That actually many people today, whether it's a young woman who has a miscarriage or somebody whose child suffers some catastrophic accident, or when these terrible moments of suffering hit, deep in our sense of being as human beings is often lurking the idea that God intended this and is punishing people for something they have done or have not done. And I think we need to take Jesus' response really seriously here, because this is a passage you better be ready to say, I know that's a really pervasive idea what you just told me, but let's look at this passage, because I don't think the God I know operates that way. You're going to have to you'll have to have a more nuanced answer than that to deal with the question of suffering, but this is a great passage for that reason. So we see a progression. We see the conflict that arises. We see that this guy's mortal and eternal status is changed. He sees now both literally and figuratively. Okay, so one of the things I drew out of this passage is this interesting process of conversion that this guy goes through. Because you're going to see this in your churches, where, there are people that kind of have these road to Damascus experience where they're suddenly attuned to the presence of God, the reality of God. But I would have to say this is more the norm that I've seen, is that it's a process. So what I'd like us to talk about, all those, let's think about farming for a few minutes. Anybody here with farming experience? Okay, we got two people at least with farming experience. Sometimes when I do a sort of a volunteer exercise, those are the people that don't want to answer. But if you guys do, you probably know a lot more than the rest of us. So I want to know if you can come up and write down the steps involved in cultivation. So right from, you're just given a brand new piece of land, and you want to, on the end of the process, have a crop. What are all the little minor steps that need to happen? Would one of you be willing to? Awesome, come on up.
You have.
Yeah, come on up. I actually want you to list them on the board, like just like this. And then we're going to read them out for our distant students. I don't think you guys, can you guys have a view of this edge of the board? You can't.
Sort of, but it's just really small.
It's really small. Okay.
So maybe write really big.
Read these out. So what's the very first thing you got to do?
So are we starting with cleared land or uncleared land?
Oh, damn!
I'm in over my head already.
Obviously uncleared.
We are starting with uncleared, completely uncleared land.
I would, John, I would soil just before I even clear it.
What would you do?
I would soil just before I even clear it.
That's true.
Is it crappy soil or good soil?
Well, soil was my number 2 thing.
Okay, yeah,
So,
yeah.
So is it clear? It's like, well, if it's not cleared, then you're going to
There's so
do
much
priority.
money.
You're going to look at the
Okay,
stuff that's
so
cleared
Go
first.
farm
it is not cleared. We're all going to agree there. So what is the first thing you got to do?
Saturation. Saturation levels. Drainage.
Okay, and we'll let him do his thing.
I was like,
We'll let
put
John
some
do his
seeds
thing,
in.
and then we'll all
Water
pick
it.
it apart. We'll do it.
Yeah, dig holes, put seeds in water.
Okay. How much further do you
Dinner.
Enjoy the fruits of your labor. I'm not going to supply it for the resolution.
I need to find other people to
Relatively short half filled with fire. Hey, water. There you go.
But we can provide something that other people like spiritual growth.
Pray for the land.
Exactly.
Okay, now as John shares his knowledge about cultivation on the board, I would like you guys to be thinking about what is the counterpart to cultivating faith.
I've gone as far as reading. I thought that would be enough.
Awesome. Okay, good. That's good.
And my experiences with the dairy farm, by the way.
You got to plot those cows real deep.
Yeah,
I'm still guessing
Have
that
to
that is
in
in
most
most of
countries.
Okay, so there's so it is not cleared, but I'm going to remove this thing about checking soil because I'm just giving you one piece of land and you don't get to say whether you have to sow.
You would still check because you would choose your plants depending on what the soil.
Because if the soil has low humus or it has low nitrogen or high phosphorus, I wouldn't do corn, for example. But I might do soybeans.
I'm right behind you there.
If it's sandy.
This might be gospel church culture, like steps 2 and 3 might be
Yeah, I'm going to add this in. Okay, so I like that we actually start here with the question, is it clear? So in other words, what kind of land are we talking about? So what's the counterpart in cultivating faith?
maybe bad experiences with church or bad experiences with prior Christians. So there's already this baggage that is already occupying that spot.
So there's a sense in both of these things, is it cleared and checking the soil, that you are paying attention. You are looking, you are listening, you are attending to this property that you have. And I would say that when you are cultivating a situation where you can share the faith, you actually start by attending to the person. Do they have baggage about the church? A lot do. Do they have strong beliefs in another area? What is their worldview? What are the points of pain in their life? What are the points of joy in their life? All of these things are actually helpful to know stuff that's going to come down. Okay? Now, this interests me. So, what's available here? This looks like, so is check exposure, is this like how much sun is there? Yeah. Okay. So here, check exposure and water sources?
Yes.
Okay. So, paying attention to the conditions. Again, you're not talking yet. You're actually paying attention to what's going on here. And then, I like this, choosing planting. So, thinking about what would work here, right? What is and by work, I mean allow you to engage in God's work of planting seeds of faith. Is it, what kind of seed? These two actually go together, don't they? What is to be sown? So choosing what to plant and then actually buying the seed, you're now making a commitment to what actually may be the thing that should be planted. Okay, tilling the soil. What's involved in that?
It's a machine. You're talking like actual farming, or
actual farming.
It's a machine that conditions the soil to prepare the seed, the soil for the seed. So if it's not clear, you'd actually have to plow first, and then you would have to till it. And it breaks up clumps of big soil, and it opens up the soil to receive the seed, breaks up the root structures of any weeds that might be there. But to put it in a very few words, it prepares a seed bed for that seed.
So you're not just talking about breaking up the sod, but you're sort of readying the soil to receive an actual seed, right? Okay, so what does that look like in the process of cultivating faith in a person?
Maybe helping them to overcome some of the barriers that they might have to listening.
What kind of barriers?
Like if they're
well, I would say if somebody's got a really big, like 3-foot layer of weeds on top there, you've got to have a way to deal with those weeds first.
And maybe big needs that are in their life already that they can't even listen without that need being addressed.
Yeah. It might be misconceptions about the faith. It might be prior hurts that have been inflicted upon them by Christians. It may be misconceptions about Scripture. I mean, who knows what the ground has been covered in. But you can see that it doesn't make a lot of sense to just be kind of hammering away, putting seed down, if there's no way for that seed to actually get in there, right? And then you've got to actually plant the seed. So what's that look like? Yeah, well, whatever you're planting, what does it look like? What's the comparable thing to cultivating faith that we call planting seeds? Information, sure. What sort of information? What is in the gospel? What is the gospel? Great. What's at the heart of Christianity? Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. Yeah. Now, of course, you don't know what kind of baggage they have with that word.
We're Anglican, we say Christ, or Jesus.
Okay. Not the Anglican circles I travel in, maybe where you go.
Because obviously the person doesn't matter, right?
Let's remember Christ is actually a descriptor. And the word Jesus, what's the word Jesus mean, by the way? Yeshua.
Lord save.
Yeah, so that's important too. Okay, so there's something about Jesus. Yeah, if we're going to talk about what Christianity is, we need to talk about who this one is that we call the Christ at the center. Next week, we're going to talk about how we express the gospel, because there are some ways that express the gospel in a captivating manner, or even a manner in which actually sparks curiosity. And there are ways to express the gospel that shut down all future communication. And I think some of us have already experienced that second thing. And we know we don't want to do that. But how do we do that first thing? So it's going to be a primary topic for next week. There's a few things missing from this list. So we've got planting the seed, and we got a weed, yes. Is there some stuff in between the weeding? What happens in between planting the seed and weeding?
Fertilize.
Okay, yeah, so there's fertilization. Somebody else.
Sun.
Water. Water, yeah.
And sun.
What else is there? What does the farmer do during this bit? Sleep. Waiting. Resting. Although usually farmers have lots of other stuff on their plate. Okay, what else in the process of cultivation? So we've got weeding, and then we're recognizing that this thing, probably the water and sun and the waiting bit, is probably going to happen again and again, right? So you are not just going to weed once, probably. If you have a vegetable garden, you're going to be weeding. You're going to be making sure there's water, that there's sun, and this is going to be repeated several times, that process. And then eventually, say you planted tomatoes, eventually, what do you start to see? The fruit, the grain, whatever it is. And then you have harvest. Right? Some point, there's not much point if you are not harvesting. What does it look like to harvest in the Christian faith?
I think it can look like, sorry if I'm interrupting someone. I think it can look like giving someone an opportunity to respond to what they've been learning or seeing about Jesus.
And what might that look like?
I think it can look different in a lot of different contexts. I think it's just key for people to have clarity about taking some sort of decisive step. And I think that could look different for different people depending on their background. Sorry to not be more specific.
Yeah. I mean, isn't it interesting that in John 9, Jesus goes back to find this guy? I mean, he's healed, he's seeing, but there's a piece still missing. So I would just say that the worship piece here is significant. And I think that someone entering into the Christian community as a fellow worshiper of God is significant. As Anglicans, we have, liturgical processes. If you've ever been to an Easter vigil and you see the people coming down, sometimes in many parts of the world where someone is baptized, they enter with one color robe and they're baptized and they're given another robe to wear. Baptism has been the sacrament of initiation into the worshiping community. So I think we need to be less reticent about saying that we have gifts that are given to us, and one of them is the sacrament of baptism. But for people that may have already been baptized, as Anglicans, we don't baptize somebody twice. And, you know, in my mind, God can sort out, if somebody's baptized twice, I'm quite sure God can sort it out. But as a practice, Anglicans don't do that. Other denominations do, because they believe in a believer's baptism. And I don't get my skivvies in and out about that. God can sort it out. But I do think that thing that Aaron spoke about giving people an opportunity. In Anglican circles, we have this thing called confirmation or reaffirmation of faith. And I think there are a lot of churches that should be thinking about having an annual service of adult reaffirmation. Just put it in the calendar. Expect that God is bringing people into relationship with himself. And express that liturgically in your midst by saying, this is a priority, this is who we are to be about as the church. So I think the way we plan our lives liturgically says a lot about who we are. If you have no plan to ever baptize adults, my guess is you're never going to baptize adults. If you operate as a body of Christ, expecting that God is going to use you to draw people to himself, and that we are given this gift called baptism to allow for their expression of that, and also for them to enter into, have their initiation into their relationship with God in a kind of discreet fashion. I think that matters, and I think we ought to take that very seriously. Okay, so here are the ones I thought of. Not as quite as nuanced as those that are in the farming community. Breaking ground. I would say that relationship is actually breaking ground. Why do we imagine that evangelism is something that happens apart from relationship? We have this image of maybe a crusade. You know, we think of Billy Graham or other great evangelists. I think it's simplistic to say that Billy Graham operated outside of relationship. Actually, the way they operated was to always engage local churches as counselors at those large gatherings, trying to connect people up with the church. They weren't always successful. But I would say when we look at scripture, we see that a relationship forms. So this blind man was already known to people. In fact, the disciples in this kind of mechanistic way are talking about it. It's almost like they're using the blind man as kind of an object lesson. And Jesus is not having any of it. So he, first of all, dismantles their prior idea about why this man is blind. And then he's not walking by this guy. He goes over and he touches this guy. Time and time again, we see that evangelism in scripture happens out of relationship. It's not always a super deep relationship, but there is interaction happening there. Removing stones, somebody here said, you know, answering questions, demonstrating a different way of life. Those things remove stones. Tilling the soil. If people see a Christ-likeness in people, but sometimes tilling the soil happens beyond our power. You know, there's this surprising phenomenon in Germany right now among primarily Lutheran churches are experiencing immigrants from Muslim countries who are having dreams of Jesus. And they're showing up in churches asking, what's this about? And asking to be catechized. I mean, it's just kind of fascinating. So tilling the soil, I would say often is, I mean, all of this is the work of the Holy Spirit, but there's all kinds of things that go on that we have no control over. Fertilizing the soil. How much time do our churches spend praying and fasting? That's another gift that we're given around reaching the people in their neighborhood. By the way, this is one of the factors that was a distinguishing factor in those 150 churches that were actually baptizing adults, is they all began with the ministry of prayer for the unchurched and dechurched people in their neighborhood. Prayer was where it started every time. So it's worth thinking about. What do we pray for? Planting seeds, sharing the good news, we've talked about that. Watering. How do we water? I think we walk alongside people. I think we don't try to force the agenda and rush people, but we actually are present with them, right? The waiting part is important. We don't expect, farmers don't expect the day after they plant the seed to see the corn ready for harvest. Why is it that sometimes in evangelism we expect that we've got to seal the deal and note the language? Why do we expect this? This is not biblical, not biblical. The church that I preached at in Nashville, there was a young woman that came up to me after the service. She said, yeah, I was in one of those youth groups where every Tuesday night we had to go out and pass out tracts to strangers. That was evangelism. See, we don't really know the damage that has been done by non-relational evangelism. I'm the first one to say, sometimes there are people that actually start thinking about God and issues through those means. But why is it our go-to? Why is it our first model? I just don't see a lot of biblical evidence for that model. Waiting, leading, removing hurdles, answering questions, helping the person deal with conflict.
Waiting does not have to be completely passive. I think it's also trusting God that He's doing something and praying towards it.
Yeah.
Supporting Him.
Yeah. How many people in our churches are praying for somebody that they know that needs to meet God? Do we make evangelism a priority in our churches? I don't see it. I don't see it in the prayers of the people. I don't see it on Sunday morning. Sunday morning has become all about us being fed. So do we actually expect that God's at work in this thing? And we talked a little bit about baptism, new life, and the starting of that process of discipleship, which we talked about earlier. Okay, in our last couple of minutes, I want to read from Colossians 1, and I'm reading from the Message, just to help us hear this passage a little bit differently. So I'm going to read 5 to 8, 13 to 14. Yeah, 13 and 14, and 26 to 29, Colossians 1. The Message is as true among you today as when you first heard it. It doesn't diminish or weaken over time. It's the same all over the world. The Message bears fruit and gets larger and stronger, just as it has in you. From the very first day you heard it and recognized the truth of what God is doing, you've been hungry for more. It's as vigorous in you now as when you learned it from our friend and close associate Epaphras. He is one reliable worker for Christ. I could always depend on him. He's the one who told us how thoroughly love had been worked out in your lives by the Spirit. God rescued us from dead-end alleys and stark dungeons. He set us up in the kingdom of the Son he loved so much, and the Son who got us out of the pit we were in, got rid of the sins we were doomed to keep repeating. We look at the Son and see God who cannot be seen. We look at the Son and see God's original purpose in everything created. For everything, absolutely everything above and below, visible and invisible, rank after rank, everything got started in him and finds its purpose in him. He was there before any of it came into existence and holds it all together right up to this moment. And when it comes to the church, he organizes and holds it together like a head does a body. This mystery has been kept in the dark for a long time, and now it's out in the open. God wanted everyone, not just Jews, to know this rich and glorious secret inside and out, regardless of their background, regardless of their religious standing. The mystery in a nutshell is just this: Christ is in you. So therefore, you can look forward to sharing in God's glory. It's that simple. That is the substance of our message. We preach Christ, warning people not to add to the message. We teach in a spirit of profound common sense so that we can bring each person to maturity. To be mature is to be basic. Christ, no more, no less. That's what I'm working so hard at day after day, year after year, doing my best with the energy God so generously gives me. You know, it's an absolutely great passage, and if we forget why we want to share faith with people and cultivate churches that can, let's go back to that passage. I want to end each class with a conversion story from my own experience in churches that I've been in. So this woman came to our church, and then she came every week. And after about 4 weeks, she finally was at that place where, you know, she kind of hung around long enough for me to say, "So who are you? You know, let's get together and have a coffee." When we got together, she said, "My story is probably going to freak you out. And I love conversations that start that way because they're usually about God at work." So she had attended church as a child with her grandmother, but when her parents split up when she was around 10, she moved away and stopped going to church. She had very tumultuous teenage years, partly because of a very unsettled home life, and she left home early. She then went through several very difficult decades with the birth of 2 daughters in an abusive relationship. By the time she came to the church, she had remarried and she was in a more stable place. But she started waking up at exactly 3:33 every morning. She said, sometimes I would lie there and just not look at the clock, not look at the clock. But as soon as I looked at the clock, it was still 3:33. She said, I also worked as a butcher. And she said, I started noticing 3:33 on all the meat I was packaging. At this point, I'm getting a little nervous, wondering, what's going on here? This sounds pretty freaky. She said, yeah, I know, it's so weird. But she said, 3:33, and somehow I knew this had something to do with God. So I said to her, well, it is very Trinitarian. She's like, what? She said, yeah, I just thought, you know, I'd come to church because this weird thing was going on. I didn't know what to make of it. And your church was the closest church. And she said, from the first Sunday, I realized there was something here that was missing in my life. That was it. She started coming. She came every week. She signed up for a mission trip. She just kind of went whole hog, as they say. But it started with this weird 333 thing. It started with her experiencing a peace that she couldn't explain any other way. She was baptized. She then got to share with her two daughters and her husband what was going on with her because, you know, they had recognized that there was sort of something new going on in her life. She remembered as a little girl watching Live Aid, which was, you know, big band, yeah, big, you know, band thing. It was one of the first kind of globalized awareness of extreme poverty and famine in Ethiopia. Anyway, she remembers as a little girl watching this and saying to her mom, "What can we do to help?" And her mom saying, "Oh, that's very far away. Because, you know, we can't do anything." But this, she remembered this. And so on her heart was this real desire to actually go to Africa and be part of some kind of thing that she could do. So she connected up with this month-long kind of mission trip where she would go and help out with teaching English. Basically a body that worked there continuously, but they relied on people to basically go and just practice people's English with them. So there she was. Now, this is not, there was no quick recipe involved here, right? This was a progression of, I think, the seeds planted by her grandmother. And decades later, she begins to have this stirring, which I would only say can be attributed to the Holy Spirit. I mean, how do you make sense of 333? But months later, she came into my office and she says, "I found it. I finally think I know what the 333 is about." So I'm like, the youth guy helped me find it. I still to this day don't know how to interpret. I don't use scripture this way. But here's Jeremiah 33:3. "Call to me and I will answer you, and I will tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." I love that verse. It's one of my new favorites because of this woman. So I would say pay attention to processes, try to be aware of your own garbage around evangelism, and next week we're going to talk about what the gospel is. Okay, have a great week, everybody.